It's back to a 2-point lead for Magnus Carlsen, and Jan, he should be feeling much better about his chances.
Yeah, great game by Jan, and what I especially liked from him is that when he got into a winning position, he took his time. He took his time to find the precise moves, and he put Magnus away. We saw that earlier in the match. He got some good positions, but he rushed a little bit, and that's where he let Magnus escape and even turn the game around. But we see that if he takes his time, he's able to beat Magnus.
And we also see that when Magnus loses a game, he goes back to a more solid approach. Look at this. Queens are off the board. It's not going to give Jan tactical opportunities. He firmly believes that he can beat Magnus can beat Jan in endgames that may look equal but have more to them than initially meets the eye.
Exactly, yeah. So perhaps the move c3 here, restricting the knight on c6. It can no longer go to b4. And you defend the pawn on d4 once more. Bishop g4, a nice developing move by Jan. I assume he should be doing fine here with a move with a rook moving to e8. But like you said before, Robert, Magnus is playing for these very small advantages. His pieces are slightly more flexible. This knight on c6, sorry, cannot go anywhere for the moment. Rook e8, the knight on e2 for the moment is under attack though.
And Magnus was mad at himself. I think the reason why is when he played c3, after the knight went to c6, is his knight couldn't jump to e5, which was one of his major plans. So Magnus seems like he's a bit uncomfortable with what's been happening, and this position does look good for white in the sense that there's no immediate risk in the position. The knight can't go to f5 now because the e2 knight was loose. He plays g4, gains more space. That knight can go to g3 from e2 as well. I can't say that I love white's position, but I think it's a nice small plus, Karpovian style.
Exactly, yeah. He just has a little bit more space for his pieces. They can maneuver a little bit easier. I guess this knight wants to go to g2. Maybe this knight wants to go to g3. King f2, bishop d2, move this rook into the game. Then slowly but surely expand on the king side. This looks like vintage Magnus. So let's see how he will try to tighten the screws in this endgame.
He brings up knight back to g2. That allows him to play bishop f4. Next, if he wants to trade those pieces, he can also play h4, king f2, rook h1, maybe strike. And I think this is a mistake that many players make, is they think, oh, just because the queens are off the board, there's no such thing as an attack. I think white can go after the black king with those pawn pushes up the king side.
Exactly, yeah. What we have here is called a queenless middle game. Only the queens have been traded, but for the rest, all of the pieces are still on the board. King g7 by Jan, moving his king up the board a little bit. Perhaps this move bishop f4 that you suggested earlier, Robert, it would force the trade of bishops. Black would have to trade, as otherwise white's going to trade themselves and give you double isolated pawns on d6. And then the knight will come to f4, and g5 all of a sudden is a threat.
I love it. And so bishop f4 looks reasonable. I might even start with h4, just because I'm not sure really if g5 is a threat from white's perspective, but it keeps that alive. So it makes black have to think. But Magnus is the one thinking here. We're about even on the clock. I do prefer white's position, but you need to create specific targets.
h4, also a nice move by Magnus. We see h5 by Jan, okay, g5. Now the knight moves back to g8. This might look passive, but the knight can reroute from g8 to a5 from where it would be putting pressure on the pawn on h4. Magnus recaptures with the knight, and actually, I like this move knight ce7, as now Jan can go pawn to c6 to strengthen that pawn on d5.
Extremely precise play from Jan, because the knight at c6 was bad. It left d5 vulnerable. He reroutes that knight from c6 to e7 to c8 up to d6. We can see more play for black. And look at c4 from Magnus. He's striking in the center while black is moving to the back rank. I feel like there are some attacking chances against the black king, especially if a knight lands on e5.
For sure, yeah. And what I also like about this move c4 and knight takes c4 is that it stops black from playing knight to d6. So now you have to find a different way to get your knight into the game. Jan, of course, could also play knight g7 followed by knight f5, but the moment you go knight f5, white can always take, and you definitely do not want to recapture with the pawn. So Jan should be doing fine here, but he still has to figure out how exactly he's going to get his pieces into the game.
And so for Magnus, king f2 comes to mind. Rook e2 followed by rook to e1, doubling on the e-file. He plays rook d1 instead. Maybe he's hinting at some kind of d5 pawn push at the right moment. And also, well, the knight was stuck on c8 for the time being, but he's trying to free both of his knights. So that knight on e7 can move successfully, and then the knight on c8 can join it afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. Rook d8, nice move getting out of the pin on the e-file. The bishop can go to f5 or to e8 to strengthen that f7 point a little bit. Robert, he might have to be careful though. Bishop e8 might run into something like bishop takes g6, and there are tactics with knight e6 check. So let's see what Jan is going to do here. White certainly has some attacking chances here.
It's a good find. The e6 square is soft, so watch out for those sacrifices on g6. And here, maybe Jan to take my bishop. That's not important. You have an isolated pawn. So I can see an argument for knight b6. Please take that bishop. I'll blockade the square in front of your IQP. He goes knight d6 instead because his knight e7 is actually covering the square. But this transition, knight d7, rook d7, into the more of an endgame, that does seem good for black.
Yeah, I like how Jan has played this. He's actually outmaneuvered Magnus perhaps a little bit. One of his knights is headed to f5. It would pressure the pawn on h4 and the pawn on d4. The knight on e7 is loose, but there's not a single discovery for Magnus that works here. If you take on g6, black recaptures with the knight, problem solved. If you take on f7, you recapture the king and the knight is defended. And if you take on d7, you recapture with the rook and the knight is defended again. So he goes king to f2.
I think it's a good move. Bring your king as a weapon in the endgame. But I like bishop f5 here. You mentioned that black needs the f5 square for a knight. Let's first swap bishops, open the d file for the rook on d8, then plant a knight on an outpost square. That h4 pawn and both the d4 pawn, they're very loose and black's staring at them.
Yeah, black would love to trade off these bishops, also because all of these pawns are on light squares. So I think Magnus should keep those on the board with bishop to f1, also because it stops black from putting a knight on a5.
Bishop f1 seems to be the correct choice at this moment for Magnus Carlsen. I'm looking at the clocks. Magnus, he is up just 10 seconds, so it's pretty even on the clock. And Jan continuing to make good moves. Let's get rook to c8. Maybe we'll have a c5 in the near future, or even a knight b5. Don't count that out, because if white takes on b5 and c takes b5, there's an open c file and only black has a rook down that line.
Exactly. So now we have an interesting position. Both sides have gotten all of their pieces into the game. And now the question is, how do you further improve? It's not obvious to me at all. I think if black gets a move or two, maybe he wants to go rook c7, defend the knight on e7 a little bit more, maybe bishop to c8, and then move a knight to f5 to hit this pawn on h4, or actually maybe the d knight, as then you also put maximum pressure on that pawn on d4.
Ooh, knight c4, so Magnus trying to trade off pieces. And if you play d5 as white, I'm wondering if black will play c5, push through, and try to give chances for a pass pawn on the queen side. So it's a big moment here for Magnus. That isolated pawn is a long-term weakness, but maybe you can't successfully push it. And if that's the case, then you're going to have to make a move like, I don't know, knight back to e5 or knight to e3, just trying to create some sort of play for yourself.
But Robert, does this actually work? Can Jan just take on d5, maybe take on c4, take on d5, and then create a pin along the d file? It all looks very loose. And also, like you mentioned before, there is that rook c2 check, so quite a risky approach here by Magnus.
I think he's going to give up that pawn in the center. So knight c4, bishop c4, pawn takes d5, maybe just bishop back to b3. It does look bad for white now that actually I'm seeing it happen on the board. And Jan, he senses that he has an opportunity. He is now up a pawn and better.
Wait, but bishop takes d5. Here's the thing, Robert. If you go rook d7, there's bishop b3. But does he have bishop to c2? Oh, there's rook d2, and then your bishop is hanging. So what is the move here for Jan? He goes rook c2 check, but now king g3 maybe?
Ooh, he plays rook e2 because if the rook takes e2, the king can take back, protecting the rook on d1. So what was the miss there from Jan? It was not easy to spot.
No, for sure it was not. So let's see what he's going to do here. Perhaps he's going to trade. The king will recapture. He can take on d5. Black should be doing absolutely fine here, but keep in mind, he's down in the match, so he would like to take advantage of any opportunity he can get. So can he perhaps cook up something here?
It is officially the final game in the 5+1, and we see pieces are being traded off. Jan realizes that he should be able to hold the draw here, but I prefer the knight to the bishop. Because in this endgame, the knight can hop from color complex to color complex. The bishop is stuck in the light squares, not attacking anything. Of course, it should be a draw, but much of chess should be a draw without someone making a mistake, and mistakes happen, especially when the players are down to a minute each.
Exactly, and keep in mind that this pawn on h4 can turn into a weakness. If black can go king e6 to f5, black can also play for win. So it's not that easy here for Magnus as well. Also, the position is fairly open, and that often favors the bishop. So let's see what Magnus will do. He goes knight e4. Now Jan has to trade as the pawn on f6 is under attack. And then perhaps he has the time to step up his king.
And king e6, there might be knight c5 check. So that could work out for black, but you need to be careful. So he plays b6 first, of course. And yeah, there doesn't seem to be any more forward jumps. King e6 coming. Benjamin, you make a good point. The black could actually win this game if white's not careful, and that king goes up to f5 and into g4.
Exactly. So king f4 by Magnus. Now king e6. The black king can move up to, well, it could not have moved up to d5 because of knight f6, but he received bishop c6 and knight c3. For the moment,